Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Malthus, and I wanted to continue on our learning shorts focused on dissemination and implementation. Now, these things are incredibly important as we think about clinical trials, and we often think about dissemination as something that happens at the very end. So once we have all of our results, we go forth and kind of certainly disseminate it in traditional audiences. And by that, I mean our peer-reviewed manuscripts or our large academic conferences and presentations. And so while that's incredibly important, I want us to all start changing the framing of dissemination as something that instead of solely happening at the end of a clinical trial, happens throughout. And one way to kind of change the framing of that is to think about the entire clinical trial process as one translational pipeline. And so again, we often think about translational sciences as just moving from bench to in-person or bedside. And I want us to change the way we think about translational medicine as really the entire process. So how do those scientific findings build upon each other and ultimately change practice and policy? And so changing the way that we think about translational clinical trials. So today, we're actually going to walk through all of these pieces in different learning shorts, but today I really want to focus on actually the red and pink pieces. So we're going to be focusing on why subgroups are so important for optimal clinical trial dissemination. One of the things about subgroups in general is that we tend to almost always hear about subgroups, at the end of the trial. It's really hard to power on subgroups, right? And so if you're really wanting to understand how this drug works in a specific age group, in a specific race, in a specific gender, it's really hard to power on that initially. And so what ends up happening is that we often have these kind of post hoc subgroup analyses that hone in on the efficacy in a really specific subgroup. There's been a lot of literature in the biostatistics world and certainly in the quantitative world about heterogeneity of treatment effect. And I just want to think about that as it relates to subgroups in particular. We know that there are certain drugs or interventions that work differently in different subgroups, whether that's because of their underlying physiology or their underlying social condition. That kind of mechanistic thinking is yet to be further determined. But one of the things that's really important is that the FDA in general has given much more guidance in the recent years about subgroups and the way that they view subgroups in their regulatory decision making. There's a lot of guidance to how to represent that statistically. And the biggest important kind of takeaway is that subgroups need to be considered from the very beginning of the clinical trial. Perhaps, perhaps the primary outcomes are powered in a different way, but we need to think about subgroups at the beginning. And while we think about subgroups at the beginning, we also really need to think about how our dissemination strategies really need to account for that. And so again, often you'll find manuscripts that almost kind of haphazardly demonstrate subgroup efficacy or subgroup differences in performance of the intervention. And that's something that really needs to be stated a priori. So we need to start thinking about subgroups as it relates to our clinical trial pipeline or our documentation processes. And certainly how we think about it in the recording of our clinicaltrials.gov outcomes. And so ideally, as it relates to dissemination, our subgroups of interest really need to be stated at the beginning. There needs to be constant kind of assessment of differences in intervention performance. And during that final dissemination process, we really need to articulate what the difference in outcomes are in those subgroups. That's so we can continue on this work to determine if there's further assessment needed in certain subgroups. In my world in pediatrics, we know that there are PK/PD differences and highly variable relationships at different ages, neonates being one, adolescents being another. Actually, it's really hard to kind of drill down on how different drugs are going to work in those different age groups. And so by disseminating subgroup related intervention efficacy, we can have a sense of where an intervention might need further study, where it might have the most impact, and in particular, where it then can be translated into more of a pragmatic design to understand real world differences. And so we'll talk about all of those things as we continue on with these learning shorts. But the takeaway from today is that subgroups are important. They need to be a part of our dissemination strategy. They need to be a part of our dissemination strategy from the beginning of the clinical trial design. And any of our scientific findings can and should incorporate subgroups, meaningfully derived subgroups, as a part of that dissemination practice. All right, thanks so much.